Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is author Avellina Balestri. Welcome, Avellina.
Thank you so much, Darren. Thank you for having me on your show.
Cheers. And today's discussion is about the Saratoga Campaign. Sorry, I can't try getting my words out there, which took place during the Revolutionary War of Independence. Something that's a bit of a sore subject for me. I'm only joking. Yeah, no. Avellina has or is currently writing a trilogy of historically based fictional books set during the Saratoga Campaign, which took place in 1777. The main character is a guy called Edward Southworth. His nickname is Ned. So please tell us about him and where the inspiration behind the character come from. And obviously, is it based on a real person?
Sure. So Ned is not strictly a real person, but he definitely is based off of various real people who were Catholic recusants. So a recusant is someone who refused, that's where the word comes from, to take the various oaths of supremacy or test acts that were passed after the split from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and then it continued with various different laws and rulings under subsequent Protestant monarchs. So you had a situation where various people would refuse to take these oaths and acts, and they would be called recusants. Most of them were Catholic, but some were dissenting Protestant groups, like Presbyterians, for example. And so Quakers were another group. There was various different groups who would refuse be considered recusants. But Ned comes from a noble family of noble blood in the north of England, in Lancashire. And they have fallen on really hard financial times, in part due to these various restrictions placed upon Catholics that continue. We often think about for example, the main bulk of kind of persecution of Catholics being in the 1500s and somewhat into the 1600s. So, kind of you think of the martyrs, the Catholic martyrs being made under like Henry VIII with regards to Thomas More and John Fisher. And then we think of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales under Elizabeth, and then again subsequent monarchs like James, and into the two Charleses a little bit, but and then in the era of Cromwell as well. We think of those, so it stretches into the 1600s a little bit, but we don't think about oftentimes, and I say this even like as a Catholic in the Catholic community, about what was the situation for Catholics in England and Britain as a whole, and the wider British Empire in the 18th century. So that was something that I really wanted to shine a light on, and so that's really the role of the Southworth family, and the focus on them up in Lancashire. And Lancashire had the highest percentage of Catholics in England at the time. It had a lot of recusants, a pretty substantial minority of them. So basically Ned's story is they come from this very, illustrious family, but at this point in time, the restrictions and the penalties and the fines, especially, that they're made to pay, and that they end up paying for other Catholics in the community, because this was the tradition. The largest house, for example, that was Catholic in the area, it was like a noblesse oblige kind of thing, that they would be expected to help pay off the fines for, the less fortunate Catholics in the area. But that, if they stick with that noblesse oblige, will really, really, really start to dent into your finances after a while, in addition to paying your own fines. So the family is in a bad way, but by the time we meet them, they're only just barely hanging on to their house. They've lost almost all of their lands except like a field, and like that's about it. That's left of their holdings, and they're really struggling. And then when Ned's father, Francis, dies, it really does look like they're going to lose the house and they're going to lose the last vestiges of everything. So Ned finds himself. This is around the time that Ned is 18, so he's a young man. And he's, all his life he has been sort of had this double identity in a way because he's got this noble lineage, but he's broke. So he on the one hand he doesn't have the various other privileges that his Protestant peers have. So, for example, there's so many different avenues that are cut off to him. I mean, Catholics cannot vote, much less actually participate in like running for any kind of office or anything like that. So they're kind of aced out of politics in any type of direct way. He is unable to go to various prestigious universities, no Oxford or Cambridge for him. He, can't go into legal work. Of course, there's no options with the church. It's all, the Anglican Church is the established church. And the military, which is the main focus of the story. Ned cannot join the military. Now, from a young age, as a lot of little boys will be, there's this kind of, romantic image of the military, of being an officer in the military. He has kind of what do they say, a hero worship going for General James Wolfe, who at the time was, again, kind of the idol of the country. This young general who dies in battle at the height of his glory, of his triumph at the Battle of Quebec. So when Ned is a little boy, he plays with all of his friends, imitating the Battle of Quebec. And they take turns playing Wolf and everything else like that. So he wants to, he has this dream to join the army, but he can't because Catholics, are forbidden from doing so. They can't carry any arms. So this is something that will come up later, that Ned, isn't allowed to have firearms or even swords. He's not supposed to be able to, for example, fence, and this was all stuff that was for someone who comes from like a noble background or even a gentry background. It's something that's so expected. It really was a kind of psychological psychological humiliation. The idea that you can't participate in hunting, you can't participate in fencing, you can't participate in, well, even in various cases, they would forbid Catholics from owning horses, which actually I reference in Ned's case that he walks everywhere. But, for someone of the upper classes to be made to walk, it's a humiliation. But that's something that they've kind of, on the one hand, grown accustomed to because that's their lot and they're trying to hold firm. But they also realize, and in Ned's case, that there's so many opportunities he can't have, and he wants to have. And as the situation gets worse and worse, and they realize they're losing even what little that they had, it really starts to wear on him. But that's when basically General John Burgoyne, the historical character in the story, comes into his life. And so that's the basic run through of Ned when we meet him as a character. And he does represent the experiences of various real recusants at the time, especially those who did come from upper class families, and the experiences that they went through.
Excellent. Well, great explanation there. Really good, really fascinating. And also, it's something that I've never really even thought about myself really either, is this ongoing persecution of Catholics during this
Mm-hmm.
period. And so are they openly allowed to, because obviously during the 16th century, as you know, and the 15th century, and then, sorry, 16th and 17th century, I apologize, they're not really allowed to openly, be Catholic, are they? They're not allowed to go to mass, and they have to do it all in
Mm-hmm.
secret. So at this point in time, are they still allowed to, take part in doing stuff like that as far as their religion's concerned?
It's still It's still forbidden. It's still forbidden. So the things that have gotten lighter are the penalties, but it's still forbidden. So, for example, I mean, Catholic priests, normatively, they're still not allowed to be in the country at this point. So this is in the story when we open is in the 1760s, like when Ned is a child when the story opens, and then into the 1770s in his teens. Um, but yeah, they're not supposed to have mass. It's still illegal. Catholic priests are still essentially outlaws if they come into the country, except in very rare exception circumstances. And they still are using priest holes to hide priests in, and we reference that in Ned's house. There are priest holes. They have been raided before. People have reported on them. There's still basically laws against them possessing various items that are deemed to be Catholic. There's the whole issue of printing presses, Catholic printing presses that they believe are printing papist propaganda being outlawed. So they can't have any number of things from like prayer books, their Catholic prayer books, which I do reference in the story, to Catholic like holy cards. There's a lot of just, you could get in trouble for having any of these things, or relic. Like then this also becomes a very important part of the story. An Agnus Dei wax seal, which was something that, was considered like a grievous offense to possess. And all kinds of things. I mean, you really weren't allowed to openly have rosary beads. It was still very oppressive. And it was one of those things, though, I will say, that a lot of recusants, especially if they came from a recusant, an area where recusants at least were a large minority, a lot of their neighbors, including Protestant neighbors, would willingly turn a blind eye. There was kind of this understanding that, yeah, we've got papist neighbors, but if they're not really bothering us, we don't care to take the letter of the law to the extreme. And so most people would just kind of cut them a break and not pursue these kind of very extreme details of the law. But at the same time, there would always be those people who, well, frankly, wanted money. And so they would, report on their neighbors. Or if there was, for example, and this is something I bring up as well in the story, it would depend on the time. So, for example, if there's relative peace in Europe, then, there was kind of like, oh, okay, well, Catholics are kind of harmless. I'll just ignore them. But if there was wars going on with France or with Spain or other Catholic powers, suddenly everyone got super, super, super heightened in their distrust of Catholics. And then you would have mobs, and then you would have riots, and then you would have people reporting their neighbors and suspecting them of all manner of thing. And this was very heightened, of course, during the Jacobite rebellions, because, you had the whole claimants to the throne, some of whom were Catholic, and then those claimants having different ties to, France or Italian states. So there's a lot of politics and religion overlapping. But for the situation of Catholics, it really did vary depending on the time, depending on what was going on in like geopolitics, and how many greedy neighbors they had, really. So if your neighbors were greedy and wanted to make a few extra pounds, really, like this is a good way of doing it. But it's one of those things where I do try to show that not every like Protestant neighbor was going well out of their way to sabotage the Catholics in their community. So there was a kind of, there was kind of, I mean, this actually reminds me of various things. Like they even said that would go on at different time periods. Like they said there would be like a kind of knowing about certain things that people wouldn't necessarily go well out of their way to report, whether that was charges of like, charges of being a bit pagan, or a bit witchcraft like at different times in history. they said only during witch scares did people really go out of their way. They said there was always those people that people considered a little too superstitious for their own good, but lots of people were at the time. They wouldn't necessarily rush to report like the local woman who was like an herbalist who kind of did some witchy stuff. They wouldn't usually go out of their way to like report her. But it back in like again even the Middle Ages and stuff like that, or into the 1600s, until you get these like witch scares. But they were always generated by something else going on, like a drought or a famine or something, a disease that was making people get paranoid. And that was the case for all kinds of things. So that is what you see with regards to the situation of Catholics, and Catholics just kind of having to do their best to get along with the circumstance. But one other thing, actually, I was going to mention in terms of the thing that Catholics feared the most and things that did really happen was Catholics always lived under the fear of the confiscation of their children by the state. And it was something that didn't always happen, but it certainly could and did happen, where if you gave the state the least bit of concern in one way or another, they really could and really did sometimes scoop up your kids, take them away from you, and put them in Protestant households. And that's something that happened to Ned's mother. And she was taken forcefully, she and her siblings, away from their parents during a scare, essentially. And so it's something that affects her relationship with her son a lot, and her kids in general. Her both Edmund and his sister Teresa, or Tessie. Her relationship with them is complicated, and kind of, it comes off as being cold, but it's because she's so afraid of something happening and then being taken away from her, essentially. And so that is, yeah, it's a real fear for her, and so that's something that these people did live through as well.
Excellent. Thanks for that explanation. Really good. And yeah, it's really made me think about things a bit differently. So, what set of circumstances? Is this a set of circumstances that are going to see people like Ned travel across the pond and settle in America? So, what's going on in America at the time, North America, as far as Catholic settlements are concerned? Because I know there is a few, isn't there?
Yeah, so it's funny. So I am a native and a current resident as well of Maryland. So we're the Catholic colony. We were founded in order to give Catholics a safe haven from this persecution as listed. That was the theory anyway. So you had Lord Baltimore and working out this arrangement with King Charles I, who, of course, was married to Queen Henrietta Maria, the Catholic French princess. And so, you have Maryland founded, and we basically were named both after Henrietta Maria, but also the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was very much of something that Henrietta Maria would have approved and appreciated. So that is what happened with us, but we were always a mixed colony. So we had Catholics and Protestants, and we had actually quite a bit of religious, kind of freedom, more than quite a few other colonies. Because there were other colonies that were founded due to the fact that people wanted, their own religious freedom, but then they usually would make that the established, kind of the established version of Christianity within that colony. And so that's how you get different colonies with completely different sort of origin stories and completely different like reasons for being. And of course, not all of them were founded for religious reasons, but even so, they all had some kind of usually religious ethos one way or the other. So for example, Virginia. Well, Virginia was mostly created for profit. The whole Jamestown settlement and everything was more kind of a profiteering mission, which was very distinct from the founding of, say, Massachusetts, and the various usually Puritan and separatist groups that settled there. Very different goals, but at the same time, there was still a religious ethos in Virginia, and that was the Church of England. So Anglicanism was the Church of Virginia. It was the church, the official church of, I believe the majority of the colonies simply were default Church of England. but you still had, again, various other groups that, were predominant in different areas. Now, an interesting one really is Pennsylvania, which I'm officially kind of consider myself a Penmar girl because while I'm on the Maryland side of the border, the Mason-Dixon line is right up the street from my house. So it's like literally we cross over so many times. I consider the whole area really my home. But the Pennsylvanians were founded, of course, by William Penn, and he was a Quaker. So the Quakers, God love them, were very nice to other denominations. They basically allowed all Christians to settle in Pennsylvania, and so you get way more religious freedom for Catholics in Pennsylvania. And interestingly enough, after Maryland loses its religious freedom because of basically a chain reaction that occurs due to the English Civil War. So the circumstances of Cromwell, coming to power and so forth causes this ripple effect to occur, among other things. There was other layers of politics going on in the colonies. But suffice to say, the Maryland government was kind of overthrown, and what you ended up with was the Catholics getting their rights revoked, and the priests being taken as prisoners back to England when they were supposed to have freedom in Maryland. And I mean, interestingly enough, I will say to Cromwell's credit, he even thought it was wrong that that happened because they were forcibly taken to England. He thought they should just be exiled to continental Europe or something. But he was sort of like, well, they actually were forcibly taken back to England, so he didn't end up executing them. He executed other people and other priests, but not them because he felt like it was unfair that they were like forced back to England from Maryland. So anyway, there was that. So yeah. So point being that in the colonies at the time, you had a diversity of peoples and beliefs and so many different groups, which did inevitably create different views about religious freedom. Although I wouldn't want to stretch this too much. I know some people do a little bit where they kind of really, really try to emphasize how vastly different views were in the colonies to the mother country. I would say there were differences, but not vast. Because, for example, the colonies were still majority very anti-Catholic. Number one, very anti-Catholic. They reacted absolutely terribly to the British government allowing Catholics in French Canada to have rights, basically, after the conquest of Quebec and wider Canada by the British. So it was the colonials who were being extremely anti-Catholic, wildly so, to the point of creating all of these sort of wild rumors about King George and the top brass of the British military converting to Catholicism. And there's a whole little fun subplot to that where you basically have, so General Thomas Gage, right? He is the governor of, the governor of Massachusetts at the time. He's based in Boston, trying to deal with the unrest coming in the sort of eve of the American Revolution. Now, his family were famously recusant Catholics all the way up to his father's time. And they were like a very, very, very strongly Catholic family. But then came the final straw for them. And his father and his father's cousin supposedly apostatized, became Anglican, because the government was going to confiscate their racing horses. And this was the last thing. They couldn't take that. That was it. That was it for them. And so, but really, I think that was a pretense. What it really was that they wanted the opportunities that came with being a part of the established church. And so, Thomas Gage is raised to be very anti-Catholic, and you can tell by his views and the things he says about Catholics when he was governor of Montreal. To be fair to him, even though he didn't like Catholics, he was quite fair to them in terms of his actual carrying out of the law in Canada, which was way, way, way more lenient to Catholics than anywhere else in the British Empire. But he didn't like Catholics. He clearly, especially, didn't like priests. He had a very, very negative view of them because I think that they almost they kind of had him raised to be more, if you will, anti-Catholic, to kind of distance himself from the fact that his family was so famously Catholic. And so it's said, so it's rumored, both his parents actually came back to the Catholic faith before their deaths. So, but all of this didn't stop the Bostonians, who were again rabidly anti-Catholic, from really targeting him as a pseudo-Catholic. So all of this was very interesting. Oh, and just very lastly, I would say the other point about I wouldn't stretch the difference too far between mother country and colonies, in the sense that in Britain, I mean, Britain was not just a stagnant entity either, where like all of the change was happening in the colonies and nothing was happening in Britain. That's kind of, it's kind of a bit of a fabrication. In truth, Britain herself was very diverse, in terms of you did have the established church that was pretty rigid, but you had all kinds of stuff going on with regards to, for example, Presbyterianism, which of course in Scotland was the actual established church, was the Kirk. And up in Scotland, you also had Scottish Episcopalianism, which was kind of the Scottish variation of Anglicanism, but the real established church was the Kirk. And then, as now, the monarch, post Glorious Revolution, post Bill of Rights, would be the governor of the church in England, but a member of the church in Scotland. And that's how, to this day, you know, if anybody wants to watch some of the videos of King Charles, you know, basically taking the oaths when he came to the throne, that's still there. So you have that diversity. You have a lot of different dissenting groups in Britain, again, ranging from the Quakers, you know, to Congregationalists, to all different stripes of Protestants existing and moving within Britain herself, and then spilling over into the colonies. So there was all kinds of multi-layered stuff going on in both worlds, I would say. They developed obviously a little bit differently, just due to land mass and due to expectation of different, you know, different expectations of things in terms of class interaction and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say they were radically different the way some people make it sound. They actually were, they were comparable. They were different on different degrees, but they were still comparable in terms of the diversity and the change that was happening in this time period.
Excellent. Thanks for adding that. And so Ned actually ends up in North America. What year does he end up, as far as the book's concerned, in North America?
So in 1777, so he ends up, give a little background on that, was that he is befriended by General John Burgoyne. So Burgoyne, he could be a whole episode in and of himself, just talking about what an extremely colorful and dynamic character he
In the
is.
future,
Um,
definitely.
in the future, definitely, exactly. He is a really fascinating character. He's not only a military commander, but he is a poet and a playwright and a scholar and a translator. And he's, you know, he's got a lot going for him. He's a very artistic character. It's one of the reasons I kind of joke that I can write him easily, is because we're both kind of artists, and writers. And so, you know, he is someone who has, you know, a record of, again, military service. He's served on the continent multiple times as the head of a regiment of horse. And he is a member of Parliament for Preston in Lancashire. And, you know, he has accumulated a lot of controversy, too. He's very much of a maverick character. And he, you know, has gotten into all kinds of little tiffs with the law at different points. And at one point, when he was running for office, he sort of accidentally incites a mob, which turns into a riot, which results in him being hauled before the bar and being forced to pay a really high fine. But all kinds of stuff like this. He was pretty colorful character. He's been accused of being a card sharp. You know, he eloped with the Earl of Derby's like teenage daughter, and he's selling his kit here and there to bet on the horses. And he's very much of a dapper Dan, and also just a he's a man about town, and he's colorful and he's fun to write. But he can also he can also be like, if you're like putting him in charge of a huge operation of stuff like to do where thousands and thousands of people's lives are involved. I mean, he has his talents, he really, really does. But at the same time, I feel like making him the like top power over something like that was maybe a mistake. So because he was, I mean, I think nowadays, you see, we would probably diagnose him as having ADHD bipolar symptoms, where he was very, very all over the place at times. And that made him very fun to be with sometimes. He could be very, very warm, gregarious, charismatic character and had big, big ideas and big ideals. But then there was other times when he would crash and burn, in terms of like he would go into deep depression, kind of stare at the wall depression. And also he would get lost in his own projects. And I mean that in the sense of also his military career, where he would set himself upon something, and his gambling instinct, he couldn't get off of it, even when all sense was telling him, no, don't kind of do this. He would get fixated, and it would drive him to things he probably shouldn't do. So that's Gentleman Johnny was what they called, and they had many nicknames for him. That's a popular one. There's also Handsome Jack, Jack Bragg. He got a lot of them. But suffice to say, in my story, Edmund meets Johnny because Johnny used to be friends with Francis, his father, right? So they used to be friends, and Francis lent John quite a bit of money when he was in a tight financial fix, which Johnny was always in. He would come into money, lose money, come into money, lose money. It would just be the constant cycle of his life. And so Francis, it turns out, sells a valuable book that was very precious to him, a religious text, illuminated text, and sells it in order to get Burgoyne some money to get him out of this fix. This was years ago. So now what ends up happening, now that Francis has died, Burgoyne comes back into the lives of the Southworth family, and he, in gratitude to the memory of Francis, saves their house. Not only does he save their house, he proves himself to be genuinely a friend to them, and tries to take the kids, this is Edmund and Teresa, who are both in their teens now, under his wing, and be kind of a surrogate to them a bit. It's particularly the young man, Ned. So he takes Ned down to London. He tries to introduce him to high society. He even ends up introducing him to the king at a garden party, and various other military figures. So we have all this, and over the years, over a number of years, this is happening in 74 when Johnny first comes back into their lives. So we learn from him and from other people about the troubles brewing in America over the various laws passed by Parliament that are directly taxing them, because of the French and Indian War / 7 Years' War, the war debts they're trying to pay off, and also in order to pay the costs to maintain continued defense of the colonies. So I mean, honestly, something that people often forget is that this was a pretty reasonable these taxes, the reason for them was very straightforward. It was quite reasonable. The thing that was being stipulated about whether it was fair or not, and I mean stipulated not just in the colonies but in Britain herself, was whether they should be directly taxed, because the colonies were used to, for the most part, doing their own thing. And so there was kind of this notion of benign neglect. That was how Britain had sort of handled her colonies for a long time. They'd given them a pretty long leash. And so, there was the question of, well, with these taxes, should they have not been passed through the houses of burgesses in the colonies as opposed to through Parliament? Since the colonies don't have representatives in Parliament. And then there was the whole debate, and then the whole sort of battle cry of taxation without representation is tyranny. which I mean, the thing is, I think also needs to be remembered is that, frankly, this this was the norm. Okay, like European powers did directly tax their colonies. It wasn't like Britain was being super unusual or anything. This was just a normative thing. But because they had actually given their colonies more leeway, there was different expectations. So there were people who had a more progressive view of this, and they were saying, "Hey, we should have representation." And then there was other people saying, yeah, but if you get representation in parliament, you're going to be outvoted anyway, and how do we make this even work? And there was many different viewpoints that were being tossed around about how to even, I suppose, make the British Empire more representative of its various parts. And that, interestingly, is something that kind of haunted the British Empire all the way through history, about how do you keep the empire together? How do you actually maintain unity of the empire while also making sure everybody kind of gets a voice somehow? And of course, at different points in history, this idea of everyone getting a voice was just unheard of, to say the least. I mean, there was no such thing as universal suffrage. I mean, even most sort of people considered to be progressive at that time period would have considered universal suffrage a bit mad. So it was very much of a thing that representation. These were new kind of things being brought up to a certain extent, but you did have various colonial writers and some British writers appealing to things like the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights and so forth as sort of backup for the argument that they were making regarding taxes and how you pass them, and laws in general. So there was all of these debates going on, and I try my best in the book to actually show the different degrees of debates between, for example, Whigs and Tories in England, in wider Britain, and how, there was people who had different views on how to handle the colonial situation. And Burgoyne himself is a Whig. However, unlike most of his fellow Whigs, he has a very conservative view, at the time at least, about the American situation. He believes that it is absolutely necessary to emphasize the supremacy of Parliament. And if you don't do that, you're inviting future chaos and breakdown of order. That there needs to be, the supremacy of Parliament. And this is actually another kind of funny thing, that a lot of people in the popular imagination think of the American Revolution as something that is against monarchy, particularly. The monarchy is the thing everyone was fighting against in the beginning. Well, it wasn't, and in some ways, actually, the situations that developed, right, were in part born out of the fact that the monarchy was no longer running the show completely anymore. So when the king was, top dog, really, prior to these things that happened under the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights and all of that, there was this understanding that, well, the king is the one that really is calling the shots and holding together all of these disparate factions of empire. So, he's the king of, England and Scotland and Ireland, but, also these various colonies along the, Atlantic seaboard and these islands and, the Sugar Islands and all of this. But the king was the one who was holding it all together. He was definitively the glue. But what happens when that is shifted and Parliament becomes the supreme thing, a representative body? Well, then the question is, okay, so if that's the case, how does that actually work in terms of like, if we're saying that a representative body is the top thing of the whole empire, well, then how does that work in terms of representing the other bits and pieces of empire? So that was the debate, and I mean, shifting all the way back around to how does Ned get there? So basically, we hear about the ongoing unrest in the colonies, and about how troops are being sent over there, being quartered over there. As we build up to 1775, when the first real outbreak of violence happens, we're still hearing about things that have happened previously. Things like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party and all of this kind of stuff. But really what causes the official kind of, now we're in a kind of a bloody struggle kind of thing, is Lexington and Concord, and subsequently Bunker Hill, which Ned not only hears about, but knows at this point someone who is killed there, and it's at Bunker Hill, and it's Major John Pitcairn, who's one of my favorite historical characters. So I had a great deal of fun writing him. But it becomes very real to Ned, and Ned has an increasing sense of wanting to participate in this war out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of loyalty, out of a sense of not wanting to be called anymore a coward and a traitor, because that is what haunts Catholics. And he wants to prove his worth. He wants to prove himself. And he really wants to go in order to do that. And as far as he's concerned with the sort of the political end of things, as he's going to tell General Gage when they meet up in a sequence, and I basically indicate that Gage is Ned's distant cousin, because recusant families, they interbred like mad. They really did. And so basically, he essentially says, given the way that the colonials, most of them anyway, view Catholics, and the way that they would deprive them of any and all rights whatsoever, why in the world should Ned really care all that much about their kind of complaints with regards to this whole representation and taxation thing? Ned has had to pay tax upon tax, fine upon fine, until his family has been depleted of everything and has absolutely no representation. So, and he is, as he's going to sort of articulate at some point, his noble blood at least. He is noble blood, a noble blood of the realm, and yet this is happening to him. So why in the world should he be bent out of shape about the colonial situation in terms of that? So by the time, what ends up happening, I'd give away a little bit of a spoiler here, Ned eventually does relent after a long sort of resistance to it. He takes the Test Act in order to go overseas as General Burgoyne's aide de camp, one of his aides, and become part of what would be called his family. That's what they would refer to as the aides. And this story really is about aides and the relationship between aides and their generals. And so we deal with showing how not all aides are sort of there to be fighting soldiers or be there to accompany the generals onto battlefields, but they are there, to do all manner of things for the general. Everything from sorting his personal belongings, to taking dictation, to delivering messages, to mixing his brandy. I mean, they're there for kind of everything. And so that is what Ned decides to do, but he hopes that he eventually will actually end up fighting, and that will kind of, prove his worth. But in the course of all of this, even though he feels like he's done the right thing to a point in the sense of being there for his local his local community as well, because so many young men, this was battle of Saratoga, not battle, but campaign, right? The Saratoga Campaign was something that was absolutely full of very young men. I mean, they said that the way it went was that a lot of people believed that this was going to be an easy campaign, and it was the way that Burgoyne built it up. And he came up with this grand battle scheme, and he's like, this will be easy, and he advertises it in such a way that a lot of people, including from very high-end families too, not even just kind of randos trying to make ends meet, we're talking about like heirs to important houses, were sent out on this campaign in order to sort of break them in. It was considered a good and maybe even a safe way to break them in into the military, and that they'd be fine. Most of them would be fine. This was sure to be okay. This wasn't even as dangerous as fighting in Europe or something. No, it's just crushing a little backwater rebellion, and it'll be okay. And it's not okay. And you end up with this massive national tragedy of, like they said, the majority of officers even on this campaign were between the ages of 16 and 19. So quite young. And they were saying people, even veterans, were horrified by just how young a lot of these people were. And they said that one person made a comment that the Saratoga campaign and Burgoyne, of course, he was pretty angry at Burgoyne by the end of all this, had destroyed the flower of the English gentry to the point where you literally had laws, and this is going to come up much later in the series, being challenged that prohibited Catholics from inheriting because of just how much of a wipeout this was. But suffice to say, Ned in book one doesn't know this yet. It doesn't know what's going to happen. But he does feel terribly complicated, in terms of his feelings, because he's done something by taking the Test Act, by apostatizing, that makes him feel like he sold his soul. He sold his soul to go on this campaign. And even though on the one hand he feels like he may be doing the right thing on some level, he also feels like he's done a terrible betrayal of not just his own immediate family, but also his ancestors, of all of his, his lineage, and of all of the people who depended on him, all of the random Catholics in the community who depended on him. And he sold out. And even though he feels like he sold out, not for completely, he didn't do it for money, right? He didn't do it for pleasure. He did it, he feels like, for duty. And then, that's commendable in its own way, but it's still, he knows in his heart of hearts, he's dealing with a situation of asking himself, what is the greater and the lesser good kind of situation? And so that's something that will haunt him through the series. It's really the kind of the main conflict is within him.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah. So also, can I just ask, so how many Catholic men would end up fighting on both sides? And I know you're not going to know the exact number, but was it quite a big uptake on both sides?
Well, so interestingly, so of course, in the regular British Army, Catholics couldn't serve unless they took the Test Act and apostatized. So in the regular British Army, Catholics were not allowed. Hence the situation of Ned having to take the Test Act and the whole bit. And this was interesting because this happened a lot with regards to recruiting in Ireland. So you've got Catholic majority Ireland, and you've got the British Army trying to encourage these Irishmen to take the Test Act in order to join the military, and quite a few, frankly, did. They did it, and then they would have their own issues later on if they actually were of a religious nature. If they weren't, they just shrugged it off. But a lot of them would then try to sneak off whenever they could to get confession, and I deal with that a little bit in the story because they would feel guilty. And some of their officers would actually turn a blind eye to it, and that they would kind of sort of quietly return to their faith. But other officers would be way, way harsher, and the penalties could range wildly. And if you were, and that's something that's going to come up in the story again, if you were caught that you had sort of reversed, your apostasy, if you had come back to the Catholic faith and you were under arms in the British military, you could get into all kinds of trouble. Everything ranging from, having being sort of stripped of everything, in terms of, having your weapon taken away from you, having your, whatever rank you were, just, kind of ripped away, sort of dishonorable discharge. And then God knows what. It really, again, depended on the circumstances and the place, but you could end up in a prison hulk, you could end up branded, you could end up pilloried, you could end up on the best side of this would be you just end up flogged or something if you're a rando and they just drop it at that. But I mean, flogging could range wildly in terms of how bad they lay it on. In this time period, it could be pretty crazy. So anything really bad could happen to you. And they would say that really people who had it out for like another soldier, another officer, if you wanted to get somebody, what you would do was that you would, claim that they're secretly Catholic. Like that would be an awesome way, at least even on a suspicion of that, you could get your pay docked. So in other words, even if they don't have enough proof to really stick it to you, they might still hold your pay. and they might still make life difficult for you. So if you wanted to mess someone up, that's the way to do it. So in terms of the regular British Army, again, you didn't have at this point in 77 Catholic serving. Now, however, later on, in the aftermath of the disaster of the Saratoga Campaign, as I just mentioned, laws started to be changed because of just how disastrous it was. And the Test Act actually ended up getting removed towards the end of the Revolutionary War. So Catholics did and could serve in the British Army towards the end of that war. And later on, you see them doing the same in the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, etc. You had a reasonable number of Catholics in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars under Wellington, for example. So all of that is pretty interesting. Now, you did have something that is true, is that while in the regular army, they didn't allow Catholics, they did have Catholic volunteers in loyalist regiments. So this was like a sort of a gray area. So you would have loyalists volunteering, for example, some of them might be from Irish or German extraction or from English Catholic extraction, like, the Marylander contingent who would, be loyal to the crown, and they were allowed to sign up without taking a test act. Or Highland Catholics, so from the Highlands of Scotland. Now, this was a situation like the Mohawk River Valley. You had people who said, hey, we'll sign up and we'll fight, but we are not going to take the Test Act, and we want to bring our priest along. And, the British government was sensible enough to be like, all right, you know what, we're not fine. And that was what happened with regards to some loyalist contingents who signed up that way. But also in the form of volunteers from French Canada. So you had that on Burgoyne's March, where you had Canadian volunteers who brought their own priest. And interestingly enough, this was unprecedented, actually, what Burgoyne allowed at that point, that he allowed the priest to come with them. And I feature the priest in my story. He makes cameo appearances. But you had, basically a situation where, so Lord Gordon, right, the guy famous for the anti-Catholic Gordon riots, which is going to play a massive role in book 3 of this trilogy. But this guy blames Burgoyne not for bad military choices. That's not what caused this disaster. No, it was because he let a Catholic priest come along, and he believes that there were repercussions from heaven, essentially, for that. So he believes that Burgoyne is being punished by God for allowing Catholics and a Catholic priest to accompany the march. And Burgoyne, to his credit, kind of rolls his eyes and is like, okay, hogwash, no. And also to Burgoyne's credit, he, for a long time, thought that the Test Act was actually a bad idea. And he thought that Catholics should be allowed to serve. And this, I believe, wholeheartedly is because he was by blood and by residence in a commuting sense, and by ancestry, absolutely, Lancashire man. And that means that he would have intimate relations with Catholics. And that's in part what started the story. I took an idea of something that I believe to be just highly, highly plausible, that he had Catholic friends, because there's no other way of almost existing up in Lancashire. I mean, like, Lancashire at the time had so many Catholics that it was just a matter of course, that Burgoyne was far more liberal. That's not to say he wasn't anti-Catholic at all. He was, but he was far more liberal than most of his peers towards Catholics. And he did vote, at risk to himself, may I add, that the Test Act be removed. He got very, very fortunate he was not targeted by the Gordon rioters, because they were targeting plenty of other members of Parliament who had voted down the Test Act. So you had a situation where by the end of the Revolution, you did have Catholics serving in the British Army, and you had them serving even beforehand in the capacity as volunteers, loyalists, or as French Canadian volunteers. Also, some Catholic, like converted Indians over the course of the war as well. So in very, very brief, on the patriot side of the fence, on the revolutionary side of the fence, you also had Catholics serving. You didn't have as strict of a test act on that, because even though you did have test acts at various points along the colonies, depending on what colony you came from, in the overall Continental Army, there wasn't a specific test act, which, you know, was a good thing, certainly, in terms of setting a kind of a stage for what eventually goes down in terms of the establishment of the United States not having test acts. Eventually, it didn't all happen at once, though. The test acts remained post-revolution, by the way, in various colonies. It wasn't immediate. But you do have good voices, for example, that were willing to give Catholics freedom and leeway, including George Washington. And he had various Catholics on board his team, including various foreign, people from Europe, mostly different continental Europe, sort of volunteers or mercenaries who were coming over. I mean, ranging from, of course, like, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was Catholic, to, I'm going to mess up the name, so I don't even want to say it. Kowski. I'm going to mess it up. So there's a Polish engineer. He was a Polish engineer who was also Catholic. You had various other Catholics of like Irish extraction. You had the Carrolls. The Carrolls were very prominent. Of course, I come from Carroll County, so they're very much of a thing here. So you have Charles and John and Daniel Carroll, the cousins, who were very influential as Catholics in both the Revolution and the early Republic. So really what it comes down to, and this is something that we do deal with in the story, and you have debates about both sides of the story, both kind of views, is that some Catholics would see the Revolution as being a really kind of positive thing, in the sense that, hey, we're getting to break away from the British Empire, which had all of these laws, and we have a chance to sort of start over fresh, start over again. And I'm going to have in book 3 a Catholic patriot character make that argument to Ned, and sort of try to convince him to come over to his side of the fence, his way of thinking on this, and saying, hey, this is like a chance, if you will, to break away from something that has been beating us down. And why should we even have allegiance to something that is like refusing to give us, basically freedom from persecution anyway? Why not take a shot at this? And so this was sort of a perspective that some Catholics had. On the other side of the fence, however, for loyalist Catholics, there was also several thoughts. Number one, you could prove your worth to king and country. You could prove your worth by showing that Catholics actually could be loyal to the crown in the face of revolt. You could demonstrate that you were worth being trusted, that maybe these anti-Catholic sentiments and accusing you of treason all the time were false. Maybe you weren't a traitor. Maybe you weren't a coward. And maybe the king really could trust his Catholic subjects to have his back. And maybe that would change things. And so there was that theory as well. And then there was also the natural, and I would say this, to me, also makes a ton of sense in terms of Catholic history. We are more historically, royalist than we are Republican. And it makes sense. We have hierarchy. There's a sense of hierarchy. Not that Catholicism is incompatible with a republic or any form of government, I would say, within reason, but it still is more naturally hierarchical. It is more naturally episcopal. It is more naturally royalist. And Christendom, at its height was, of course, a very royalist society, and all of the traditions of royalty, I mean, of coronation, for example, I mean, they were considered by the church to be a sacrament. And even though, sure, you could look at the split, the Anglican split, and say, well, how do Catholics view that then? Well, it's not strictly speaking kind of a sacrament anymore if you're going by a kind of a split, but at the same time, it's impossible not to see it on some level as a small s sacrament, because of these ancient traditions that are yet preserved in the concept even of a king as being the steward of God, as being a representative of 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 God to man, and in a way also representing, I suppose, the spiritual essence of the nation or the empire, for that matter, within a person. There's something very incarnational about that, something deeply Christian about it. And, again, if anybody's watched the coronation, King Charles III, the beauty of it, I think, I mean, especially for a Christian, but for a Catholic, is really to see these very particular traditions that are based upon very, very ancient things that are based upon the faith. So for a Catholic, I think my point is that, to be honest, I think the more natural instinct would be to be loyalist, not to be patriot, because to be loyalist is more in keeping with the traditions of Catholicism, in terms of that connection to monarchy. And after a while, even though, as I said, in the beginning, the revolution wasn't actually a revolt against monarchy, it became that because it got infused with various Enlightenment thought, but Enlightenment thought that was taking a turn in a direction of being very kind of Greco-Roman in emphasis and a real kind of idolization of the early republic. But you basically had a question, therefore something else that I think Catholics and Christians would ask would be, well, is that not in a way pagan? Which was, I have that brought up as well in the conversation. So I try very hard when writing. This is like something that's very, very important to me when writing historical fiction, whether it's dealing with this book and this trilogy, the American Revolution setting, or my previous work, which is set during the aftermath of the Norman Conquest in England. It's very, very important to me to have characters be able to flesh out their own points of view and make the strongest cases for themselves that they can. Because all too often in historical fiction, we see a tendency to just want to push one viewpoint or another in a very polemic way, as opposed to allowing the characters to really, number one, inhabit their own time period, inhabit their own cultural normative, and also to be able to make a case for, why they feel what they feel in the strongest possible terms, including if that is not popular right now in this time period in history. So that's something that I strove to do with regards to Catholics and what their potential reaction to the revolution would be.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah. And so we do move into the Saratoga campaign itself. So can you give us a bit of um, give us an overview of that particular campaign and what was involved, please?
Sure. So, again, you have General John Burgoyne, and he has a strategy that he devises where essentially the basic plan was to cut the colonies in half, right? To try and separate out the colonies from what was considered to be the trouble spot of New England, of Massachusetts, to be able to control the Hudson River. In order to do that, Burgoyne intended to march down from Canada through New York State, the wilderness up there, and get to Albany. And then what would happen was that General William Howe, who was in New York City at the time, would march up with his men to meet Burgoyne. And you would also have another contingent, under Barry St. Leger, who would march. Actually, I think it's St. Leger. This is one of those things. I'll have to check if it's Leger or Leger. But anyway, he's supposed to come and meet them as well. So it's supposed to be a three-prong kind of thing. And so it sounds good on paper, but it's complicated, and there's a lot of Murphy's Law involved. Number one, the three-prong kind of element means you're gonna have to make sure everybody's where they need to be when they need to be there. And there's all kinds of stuff that could prevent that from happening, both in terms of just personal decision making, which, with Howe, that's a big thing because he ends up wanting to take Philadelphia. He's like, oh, that would be easier to take. And General Howe had this little problem. I mean, look, I actually feel for the man. He, number one, strikes me as a sensitive soul, where he was, kind of traumatized from war, even during the French and Indian War, when his older brother, Lord George Augustus Howe, was killed. He ends up dying in the arms of Israel Putnam, who later on goes on to have the famous lines, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," at Bunker Hill, just showing what a very nasty type of civil war this ended up being. But basically, William Howe handled the death of his eldest brother really, really poorly, and we could see this in a very interesting letter from General James Wolfe, who, of course, is going to go on to be the famous hero of Quebec. But what he talks about previously is about how absolutely shocked he is by the death of Lord George, and he's saying he was the rising star of the army. Who the heck will replace him? Not realizing he's going to be the one to replace him in terms of, the rising star who will become a legend. But in that letter, also, there's some lovely personal details. I love for the personal stuff where he talks about how he's worried about Lord George's aunt, who loved him like a mother. She's going to be very distressed, but also about William Howe, the youngest brother, because there's the middle brother, Richard, as well, how he is not eating. He is not eating. He just is laying in his tent. He refuses to eat for days. And he's talking about how they really need to force him to eat because he's going to starve himself. And so I get this impression that William Howe was a sensitive person, because then again, we get this at Bunker Hill, again, the location where all of a sudden Putnam shows up again, ironically. And every officer around Howe, after he makes this charge, is either killed or wounded. And I mean, vast majority of the men as well. So he's almost alone up there, and he freezes and he starts to cry. And frankly, he could have very easily been killed. And I'm partly convinced that Putnam deliberately spared him, and in memory of Lord George, because I think he always felt a bit bad about being the scout that kind of led Lord George into the ambush by accident. So I think that was part of it. Anyway, Howe was very, very traumatized by what happened at Bunker Hill. He never really seems to have fully recovered. And he was very determined that he should never risk his men's lives unless he was sure, almost super abundantly sure, he could win. So this whole plan with Burgoyne was not convincing to him. And so instead of going to help Burgoyne when Burgoyne ran into trouble, he decides, well, heck, I'll go down and attack Philly instead. And again, part of this, I think, was because he did have this trait about not wanting to risk his men's lives unless he was almost certain of victory. But also the fact that he and Burgoyne were rivals, so there was a selfish end of this as well. Like, he kind of wanted to be seen as the hero of the hour. So there was that was a potential of going wrong. Barry St. Leger, or Leger, because I'm probably messing it up, ends up getting waylaid, and then ends up basically in a battle he didn't want to fight, and then not being able to go join Burgoyne. So Burgoyne is alone out there. And you basically have a situation where he didn't think this out well in terms of the sheer just stuff that could go wrong on this wilderness hike. And so you have everything that goes wrong practically. I mean, it just turns into an absolute, folk horror nightmare. So not only do, loyalists not come out to, physically volunteer their services to the extent that Burgoyne would like, But also the Indians he gets on board are extremely undependable. I mean, it's a situation where, you almost you need them in a way because they're helpful in terms of guides and knowing the wilderness and everything else, but at the same time they have a very tribal understanding of warfare, and they are going to kind of do what they're going to kind of do no matter what you tell them. They have their own reasons for being there, and they also have their own methods of fighting. So you have the whole Jane McCrae disaster and scandal, and some of the Indians just kind of going rogue on Burgoyne, and Burgoyne feeling like he has a tiger by the tail he's afraid to let go of. And he's afraid they're going to end up attacking him. And in the end of it all, most of them abandon him. Some of them attack him, and then they just kind of go rogue on the frontier. Everybody blames Burgoyne. It's a disaster. You have the Patriots in the area are pretty well dug in. They're sabotaging the train left, right, and center in terms of chopping down trees, burning bridges, etc., burning crops. Burgoyne has some early successes in terms of capturing Fort Ticonderoga, but later on he basically overstretches himself, or he stretches out his supply lines. Then he ends up cutting his supply lines after making this very famous and a bit crazy speech where he says Britons never retreat, which is nuts any way you look at that. um, but actually, on the topic of nuts things that don't make any sense in that vein, I would say that another kind of wacky thing that is said about this campaign, I've run into it multiple places. I don't know who started it or why, but it's kind of funny to me that they will say that Saratoga was the first time in history a British army had surrendered. I don't know who the heck started that, but it's not true, obviously, because especially when you're like, well, what do you mean by British army? Because I'm just like, what? Like, at best, I think what they mean by that is that it was the largest British army since the time of like the Act of Union in 1707 to surrender. That's fair, I think. But yeah, I feel like they're just overdoing that and making Burgoyne like even more of a loser than what happened. I'm just like, oh, cut the poor man a break. So anyway, the end of the Saratoga situation was they're getting sabotaged left and right. They've been abandoned by many of their allies. The numerical situation in terms of deaths is starting to pile up on them because of various skirmishes they end up fighting that they didn't want to fight. The Battle of Bennington, which they try and they go to get supplies, and that ends up failing. High death count on that. And then they end up, fighting the first Battle of Saratoga at Freeman's Farm, which is also a terrible losses that they take. And they're really struggling, and the fact is they find themselves wildly outnumbered in the end of it all by the continental revolutionary forces, and they basically find themselves in quite a situation that probably the most intelligent thing at that moment would have been to turn and try to go back to Ticonderoga, maybe even Canada, which again they could have done earlier before they crossed the Hudson, but Burgoyne again was like, Britons never retreat, we're going forward. This is another opportunity for him to see the writing on the wall and turn and go back, but he won't do it. And so he's single-minded in this, and I think there's a part of him that's the gambler's instinct. And plus the fact that like back in Britain, he makes this call that he's made all these bets, right? That he will have this whole thing in the bag by Christmas, and he'll be home to collect. Okay, Burgoyne, we know for a fact, didn't have money to begin with at this point. That the band is like literally borderline ending up in the poorhouse. And he doesn't have this money. He knows that he was just like so sure of victory at this point that he makes these bets that he thinks they're going to kind of give him the money he needs to pay off, his other expenses. But now he's realizing that's not going to happen. and he's going to lose even more money. So that I think is a contributing factor, but also just the fact that he knows that if he goes back, he will be considered, even as a person who retreated, that his whole plan was kind of a failure. He doesn't want that on his reputation. And also, I think there is the element that he was considered, the soldier's friend. He was considered, even by his enemies, to be humane and tender to his men. He had a good reputation that way. And I think there was a part of him that truly felt guilty about the losses that had already been taken and didn't want to retreat because it meant that they all died in vain. And he didn't want that. He wanted so badly to make their deaths mean something. And so, he didn't want that to be wasted. He felt obliged. And so on he goes with what later comes to be called by General Simon Fraser, one of his top brass he had on his team, who both appear extensively, particularly Fraser, in my trilogy. There's, General Simon Fraser of Balmain, a Highlander. He has a whole other very fascinating story. And also General William Phillips of Welsh extraction. So you literally have all of Britain represented here. You've got the Englishman, the Scotsman, and the Welshman here together on this disaster route. And so no one is left out. No one is left out. And so you basically have a situation where, Burgoyne presses on to Bemis Heights. And it's a disaster, a total unmitigated disaster. And Fraser, who had strongly advised against this attack and had been trying to be the voice of reason here with Burgoyne for a while, Burgoyne won't listen to him. But Fraser, you gotta love him. He puts his absolute all into this battle, even though he thinks they're gonna lose. He thinks they're toast, but he's still, when he's the last guy out there essentially trying to hold this line, which is literally doomed to crumble, and he is riding around breakneck speed, sword in hand, shouting encouragement and orders, and making sure he's seen by the men, and he is determined, to the very nth degree of everything to hold this line, and part of it, I think, really is that, he has, again, this fascinating background of having been from the clan that had been, involved in the 45 Jacobite rebellion. And so, there's always this question hanging over him about loyalty, because he, like so many Highlanders caught up in that situation, ends up fleeing the country when he was in his teens, and ending up as a mercenary abroad in Europe for the Dutch. And he ends up returning and receiving a pardon and joining the Highland regiments that are raised during the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, where he sees action at Quebec under Wolfe. And legend has it he was actually in the boat with Wolfe that crossed the St. Lawrence River. And that he, because he was so fluent in French, was able to trick the sentries into allowing the boat to pass. So that's a little anecdotal thing. But here, it's a situation where I feel like he is fighting not just, to hold this line for, at this point, his king. I believe he really did. I think he was sincere in his, at this point, acceptance of the Hanoverian house as truly his sovereigns. But also, and for his friend, because the thing is, he and Burgoyne were truly, genuinely friends. They were confidants. It makes the whole thing so much more tragic that, in a sense, Burgoyne sent him to his death. So what ends up happening again, but I believe that he also was fighting for his own name, for his own reputation to be restored, for the Frasers to gain back, what had been taken, including their lands, which also had been forfeited. He represents not just even his clan alone, but also all Highlanders in the same position. They're suffering under their own prohibitions. So in the end of it all, he gets targeted by Benedict Arnold, of all people. So Benedict Arnold is on, he's still on the Patriot side at this point in time. I believe it's very evident he has it personally out for Fraser, because he felt like Fraser halted his advance. He even sort of says this, Fraser halted his advance the previous battle and at other points, and he is not at all happy with him, and he feels like this. He basically says, "He is a host in one man. I do not wish to see him long. He must be disposed of." Very, very Arnold. So Arnold, even though, frankly, anybody, including Burgoyne, who's watching the situation, knows that Fraser cannot hold this line indefinitely, Arnold wants to make extra sure. So he essentially turns to, the rifleman company and is essentially like, I want like your top marksman, and I want him to get in a leverage point. I want you to take him out. And even the sniper at this point is kind of like, that feels a little bit skeeve of you to say that, because this is like a general sort of setting up the assassination of another general, which again in the 18th century it's considered skeeve, even for a marksman. He felt like this was a bit skeeve for one general to do it to another. But Arnold, being Arnold, is like, I don't care. I don't want to see him long. Go for this. And so, of course, Timothy Murphy is believed to be a sniper that does this. And Fraser gets terribly mortally wounded in the abdomen, and it's a really horrific wound. The poor man, he lasts all night afterwards in horrendous pain, because it was he was like partially disemboweled by the way that the bullet fell. And he is taken to the women's quarters, where, panicking women and children are around, and he feels really bad because he can't stop himself from screaming, and he is apologizing on repeat to everyone and for being such a nuisance and whatever, and it's really tragic. And then he famously says, and I suppose this is the wraparound, "Oh, fatal ambition, poor General Burgoyne, my poor wife." And there's this whole fatal ambition is kind of the crux of the situation. It's this great Shakespearean tragedy. It always struck me that way. And this is sort of ironic because of just how much of a Shakespeare fan Johnny was. He was fundamentally a theater man, and he loved Shakespearean dramas. And so it's just fascinating to me how much of Shakespeare's in this, and almost a certain Arthurian tragedy to it as well, sort of the breaking up of the round table or something. So there is that one could see. Also, something else which I always found interesting is the fact that Johnny was a Richard the Lionheart fan. He translated French romances about the Lionheart and put them together into play format. So all of that is just really fascinating, given all of the similarities you can see between Johnny and Richard's personality types and styles. They're very, very bold on the field. They will risk themselves for their men. They are well liked by their soldiers. They can be overly confident and passionate and cocksure. They have, I think another thing that's interesting is that Johnny, even though he, like Richard, is not exactly the most moral fellow in terms of chastity, at the same time they have a religious instinct, both of them. And so there's so many elements, and the fact that they both end up as prisoners of war in the end. So you have this situation. Burgoyne, the death of Fraser and the aftermath involving the funeral, in which the funeral of Fraser ends up being cannonaded, shelled. It's such a again, it just this tragedy to it. And such an almost Armageddon-like feeling. The fact that wolves come out and end up like attacking the British camp and haunting the whole area and going after the dead and dying. It's just, again, kind of a horror film vibe, but it's something that for the story that I'm telling, I think it kind of does bring into sharp relief what Edmund feels in terms of having made the sacrifice of conscience he made to go on this track, and then for everything to go wrong the way it does, it has to feel like a punishment. It can't not. And so basically, yeah, the end, of course, just the history of it with Saratoga is that 10 days later, 10 days after the disastrous second battle, Burgoyne is forced to surrender. He tries to call it a convention so as not to call it a surrender, but it is a surrender. And they ended up in the last 10 days were absolutely horrific too. because they ended up in a crossfire of just intense cannonading and sniper fire. And, people, they were so malnourished and dehydrated because of, the lack of supplies that had occurred and being blocked off to water sources. And disease was absolutely rampant. It was just a terrible experience for everyone involved in this thing. And so, that becomes the turning point of the American Revolution. No one expected it to go like this, really, particularly on the British side, certainly not Burgoyne. So it really is a kind of a shocking turn of events, that you end up with this. And it becomes the impetus for France to enter the war on behalf of the rebellion, for their own purposes, of course. They wanted land access and so forth. But that is what ultimately happens, that of course ultimately pulls kind of the revolution over the edge to success. So it's considered the turning point, and Burgoyne is forever remembered in that light, which, in some ways is sad. It's part of the tragedy because, he had so many good qualities and so forth, but he is the one who oversees this great national imperial disaster. So that, there's all of that. The story always fascinated me. It was always one of my favorite aspects of the American Revolution because of the components of high drama and tragedy, really, that kind of bring out different aspects of just the human condition and experience.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you, actually, Avellina, what inspired you and what was it about this period that you found so interesting and that made you want to write a book about this?
Yeah, so this was something that I always had kind of wanted to do, in terms of like, yeah, like even when I was quite young. The thing is that I actually started out being interested in British history, fundamentally through Robin Hood and the legends of Robin, and also King Arthur, and kind of the Middle Ages, the medieval ethos of England and the wider British Isles. And then, over time, I became interested just more broadly in British history and various things connecting with it because of my interest in the Catholic martyrs. Of course, that's sort of the Tudor era for majority of it, but it also connects to the Stuarts. And before long, you just get one thing connecting to another, and you start thinking about the American Revolution, that, sort of most prominent overlay in our collective consciousness of American and British experience, when we were, well, one and the same thing when you get down to it. So that drew me in. It fascinated me. I also loved the material culture of the 18th century because it straddles both, an earlier, kind of medieval reality with a modern sensibility. Things like, for example, the gorget, that was worn by officers. It's the last piece of chivalric armor, which was still being used. And I don't know for the life of me why we got rid of that in terms of ceremonial, kit. Like, I don't get it, to be honest, why that was dropped. It seems like something that Britain for sure would have preserved, given how many other ceremonial items have been preserved in terms of, again, ceremonial functions. But for some reason it did. Maybe we can sign a petition. but yeah, it's a situation where, to me, it was fascinating on a material culture level, also because you could read the writings of these characters, their letters, their speeches, their journals, their poetry and plays. You can really feel them because the language is now much more accessible than it would be in previous centuries. So that really drew me in. I just fell in love with various characters. I got very close to them by reading about them. So I always wanted to kind of do an American Revolution story. And I've been working on it since I was like a kid, since I was like 12, some version of an American Revolution story. But finally, it kind of came on the heels of finishing my first Robin Hood book, which I think is just, it was meant to be that I did Robin Hood first because that was sort of my gateway drug. into being a Britophile. And sort of to then move on to the American Revolution, I think just sort of made sense for me. Um, and it made sense, I think, even more so because of the fact that, the medieval world is very still present in my narrative because, as I mentioned, things, for example, like the Catholic recusant experience inevitably hinge upon a memory of the Catholic past, which was, of course, the medieval world, but also things like Burgoyne having this deep fascination with Richard the Lionheart. That is, of course, something that just is an invitation to connecting those themes. As I said, also the Arthurian tragedy element is there very prominently. So, I kind of started to think about it and, well, Burgoyne, he thinks of himself as a knight, I think, like his ancestors. He thinks these are people who, when you start to think about it, they're the descendants of Normans, the Normans, Burgoyne as a French origin name. So is Fraser as well, for that matter. And actually it's interesting because, Ned is one of the characters who doesn't have a Norman name, is a Saxon name. So there's a sense that he's older than some of the other families. Um, but basically all of these things, because I had this background and fascination with Britain and with her many layers of history and culture and religious tradition, that for me was important to bring to the table when I did the American Revolution story. Because all too often, American Revolution fiction, even nonfiction, I would say, but fiction, media, etc., becomes very much just reduced to kind of this polemic for the revolution. And I just, it becomes cheap. It's not good art, it's not good storytelling, it lacks a genuine human element. Unlike, I would say, the American Civil War, and I can actually tie that in because the American Civil War, we view it as this very much of an emotive thing about brother against brother. That's something that is important to the way we tell the story. But that's because the Unionists won. That's it. That's why. If it didn't, then I don't think we would probably remember it that way, the same, even if it were true. It's the same here. Ultimately, the American Revolution is about kindred fighting kindred. It's about people of the same blood and language and culture killing each other. There's a tragedy inherent to it. It is a civil war. I mean, it's very much of a civil war, even on the bare bones fact that Americans, this is why if you've noticed, I'm very, very deliberate and I don't call it the American Army because it's not accurate. It is, there's Americans fighting on both sides of this conflict. So it is not, the Continental Army, the Patriots, the Revolutionary Army, the rebels, but they're not just the Americans. The Americans had many different points of view on these issues, and there were many Americans who were, in fact, loyal to the crown and considered themselves equally American and British. And they didn't see that as a dichotomy. They saw that as simply what they were, part of the whole of their identity, their personhood. So I wanted to really bring that to the fore. I wanted to emphasize that. I wanted to make also it more like a true work of classic literature, more in that vein, more akin to War and Peace, where the war is absolutely there. It's absolutely integral to the journey of the character, the main character, and all the other characters for that matter, all ye that pass by. But it's more than just the war. It can't be reduced to the war as the main conflict. There are conflicts of the heart that are, I think, fundamental. The war is one thing, but there's deeper conflicts and there's deeper, I think, things to explore in terms of the characters, than merely, again, being a polemic, which is sadly how things get reduced. And when you think about so many things, just ranging from, the very kind of obvious thing that comes to mind is Mel Gibson's The Patriot. But you have other stuff. You have Hamilton, and you have various other productions, like, what, there was this one show, Sons of Liberty, that came out that just absolutely demonized General Gage in a really wacky way. And you have things like Turn, which just kind of mess up characters terribly. Like, they make King George III just a complete tyrannical, raving lunatic in a way that frankly didn't even resemble his later mental and physical health issues, but he isn't even having them at this point in time, so it's all very ridiculous. And things like, I mean, Outlander's representation of Fraser is just absolutely declawed. Like, they don't allow him to be the dynamic, like, warrior that he was. They just kind of make him, again, just a lesser character, who just seems like he can't be bothered to move out of the line of fire, and then just is like, oh, I'm just kind of happy to die just as long as I'm in a war, which I think is a very insulting stereotype for like Highlanders, actually.
Mhm.
And it takes away the whole fact that no, this is a 47, 48-year-old guy who has a lot to still live for. He's not about to die because, contrary to common belief, not everyone dropped dead at 40 in this world. And he has a wife and he wants to go back home. And no, he didn't want to die horrifically. That's simply not the case. He didn't want to die also in a manner that was humiliating, which it would have been considered to be targeted like a beast. Targeted in that manner was considered to be humiliating. So taking away his humanity simply because, again, to try to kind of reduce everything, really, I think. Because it sort of like, again, there's a vibe with Outlander. It leans into kind of a lot of Scottish nationalist stereotypes as well, which can tie all the way back to Mel Gibson again with Braveheart, etc. So there's just a lot of bad history, I suppose, out there. There's a lot of bad history, and there's a lot of, I think, a tendency to undermine Britain and British identity and British heritage and British history and what that actually has meant to generations of people who have gone before us and the memory of the British dead. And I say that in a way that includes the American dead because, again, many people considered themselves both American and British. And it's something that I always think about, where it's like I'm not writing something dealing with foreigners, not to me, not to my mindset. This is something that, like, these characters, Burgoyne, Fraser, Pitcairn, Gage, countless others that I've featured, they're just as much a part of my heritage because my heritage goes back to being British ultimately, and they are British, and therefore they are part of my heritage. They are, to an extent and by extension of history, my countrymen. So there's that. There's so many layers of that, and that's something I wanted to express and I wanted to bring to the fore within the writing, as well as, dealing with the background of Catholics and their situation. I kind of wanted to do both of those things.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And so obviously this is book one, but when can we expect two and three?
Oh, well, so, well, firstly, I probably need to go back and finish book two of Robin Hood. So have it's called The Telling of the Beads. That's that series. But I am still working on book two and three of All Ye That Pass By because I have, like, ideas are still coming to me, and I always feel like when ideas are still coming, you write them down because they might, leave you,
Yeah,
and you don't want them to do that.
yeah, I know how that
So
feels. Yeah.
absolutely, and you want them to you want to get them down. You want to kind of capture them while you have the inspiration. And I write out of order anyway. So the thing is that I've written a number of sequences already in both book two and book three. So there's stuff already laid down for that. So I'm still going back and, like, adding stuff even now, even though I was trying to take a break. Like, I just
Hmm.
can't, like, when I'm coming up with different ideas. Like, so for example, what I was just writing yesterday, to give an example, is that I was writing for book three a scene that is a cameo for Major Patrick Ferguson, who was the British commander at the Battle of King's Mountain, who was killed there in the southern theater of the war, the latter half of the war. He's a Scotsman from Edinburgh. Very, very colorful, very cheeky character. And so what got me going on that was that I had a book out from the library on him, and I was typing out some of his letters home. And so while I was on the project, I'm like, oh, I want to write, an inclusion of him, a cameo, where he, can show up and interact with Ned. There's always the temptation. I think people have said this to me: is Ned you, Avellina? And I'm like, well, not entirely, no, but I mean, there's elements, of course. There's elements of, sure, like you want to explore, for example, some of these historical characters, and you kind of would like to have a character who's able, because of the way you set them up in the story, to do so and to meet them and to have a conversation with them. And that is something for history buffs. I'll always do that a little bit. But yeah, so for when will book two come out? I mean, if we're really fortunate, I'll say probably like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, probably between a year and a half to 2 years. I mean, we're really, really fortunate, a year, but I don't want to amp up expectations too much.
No,
but but we'll see what can be done. At the very least, I've sort of hit the ground running with it. So, what I will say is that book one, just to give a sense of timeline, book one ends about halfway through the March, Burgoyne's March.
Mm-hmm.
So we are when the book ends, it is August. So they started on the March in June and it ends in October. So we're in August of the March when the book ends, book one. Book two picks up from there, and we get to right before the surrender. So book two gets way more intensive in terms of time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything gets super, super focused on those last months and all of the chaos, really, that goes down. And then book three picks up at the surrender itself and then follows what happens to the characters after that. So that's what I'll give away so far, that we follow Ned in his journey to kind of becoming his true self. Some things will happen. Mm-hmm. That will, cause him to make decisions that will definitely set him on very specific courses that lead to the ultimate climax of his journey.
Okay, and if people want to get hold of your book, do you have a website where they can go to, or is it on Amazon?
So they can go to Amazon. Just look up "All Ye That Pass By, Gone for a Soldier" by Avellina Balestri. I'll send you also the link to put in the comment section or the description, if you'd like, of my Amazon page, because you can also find on there, in addition to this book, my Robin Hood book, The Telling of the Beads, book one, Saplings of Sherwood, and also my poetry book, Pendragon's Shield, as my poetry collection. And then there are a number of anthologies I've been a part of that are for sale on there as well.
Yeah, we'll make sure those are all in the description for you. Excellent. So,
excellent. Thank
and
you.
You do have a YouTube presence yourself, don't you?
I do, yes. So it's mostly music. So I have technically two, because I run a literary magazine, Fellowship and Fairy Dust, so they have a YouTube channel as well. Things have just been a little bit crazy on that end because we had a terrible hack. So it was really awful, and that's also why my author's site is down. We basically were under the same Bluehost account, and unfortunately we just got maliciously hacked, and it ended up where our sites are basically all over the place and kind of whacked out. But we're trying to resolve the problem as best we can, as soon as we can. So I'll send over those links as well, just for you to have them. Right now, everything's a bit of a mess, but we're working on those links. But what I would say is I also have, yes, I have a YouTube presence. So there's the YouTube channel that belongs to FNF, but then there's also my YouTube channel, which mostly is
Okay,
music.
cool.
So I perform folk music and some original music as well, which kind of does fall into the folk genre. Folk and religious music mostly. And it also has on it my like teaser for all you that pass by. So there's a teaser that my friend, confidant, and fellow author Leah Fisher kindly put together for me. Actually, while I'm on this, I want to just give her a pitch because she doesn't have it out yet, but she's working on a duology about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he was part of the German resistance movement in World War II and was a Lutheran pastor and theologian who basically was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. And then ultimately he ends up, getting captured. The plot fails, so he gets captured, and then eventually he gets executed. But she's writing a really good series, and again, I just have appreciated a lot myself because I have done, beta reading and editing on it. So just for those who like history, I'd like to just let everyone keep an eye out for that because that
Wow,
should
yeah,
be
that's
coming soon.
exciting.
So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for giving up your time to come and speak to me about the
Oh, it was a
Saratoga
pleasure.
campaign,
Thank
your
you.
book, and everything like that. Like Avellina said, I'm going to make sure everything's in the description. So if you want to find Avellina, you will be able to do that as well as her book. And all that is left to say is thank you very much.
Thank you so much as well. I really appreciate you having me on and letting me filibuster there a little bit. Thank you.
You're fine. And all that is left to say is cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.